Welcome to One Step Past. I'm Bucky Wild, and this is Action Heroes of History, John Paul Jones 2. By the time he was 28 years old, John Paul Jones had already lived a full life. He had been a sailor since he was 13, a captain when he was 21, enjoyed a bit of wealth, and seen a fair bit of the world. John had been accused of murder not once but twice, ultimately fleeing to America and changing his name to avoid prosecution. While in America, he got connected with some powerful men in politics who helped him get a high-ranking position in the new Continental Navy right from the start. He was a first lieutenant in the beginning and ultimately became a captain in less than a year. In a 4-year period of time, Jones would see more action than he had in the rest of his years combined. John Paul Jones would have his glorious victories, but also some crushing personal defeats. He would become reviled by the British throughout history, but most of Jones' enemies were American. This is John Paul Jones. 1775. The Alfred, the first time around. John Paul Jones became the first lieutenant of the Alfred on December 7, 1775. The captain was Dudley Saltonstall. He didn't make much of an impression on anyone as a captain, especially with the second-in-command John Paul Jones. Jones hated Saltonstall and found him distant and aloof. Ironically, Jones had been accused of this by his own crews in the past and would continue to be in the future. Sometime in December, the Alfred became the first vessel to fly the Grand Union flag, the precursor to the Stars and Stripes. This flag was hoisted by John Paul Jones himself on the Delaware River. It became one of Jones' most iconic moments. In the beginning, the Continental Navy was very small, and it was going against the whole of the British Navy. There was the Alfred and 4 other vessels. Anyone serving in the Continental Navy had to be very bold and nervy. It was like fighting a lion with a stick. Essex Hopkins was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Navy. He had the unenviable job of figuring out how America was going to defend itself from the powerful British Navy, while at the same time fight them and win. Hopkins became an important figure in John Paul Jones' life. The two would eventually become bitter enemies. It wouldn't be fair or accurate to label either Hopkins or Jones as the bad guy in their conflict, because both did important things for America's First Navy. It is a fact, however, that much of Jones' job stress in his first few years with the Navy came from Hopkins. 1776. Everything was tough back then. The American fleet was to set sail on January 4th, 1776, but freezing winter weather prevented their departure until February 18th. Everybody has a boss, and so did Essex Hopkins. He answered to the Marine Committee. Joseph Hughes, head of the Marine Committee, was the Secretary of the Navy. Hughes had also liked John Paul Jones, a fact that would become more important later on. Hopkins had been ordered to have his fleet attack the British warships harassing American shipping in Virginia, South Carolina, and Rhode Island. He was given the discretion, however, to abandon these orders if the mission was impossible and come up with something on his own. Hopkins would come up with his own plan and was later punished for it. By the time Hopkins' ships broke free of the ice, the British were too strong in the Chesapeake. Hopkins decided to head to the West Indies instead. He knew the American colonies were in desperate need of gunpowder. He decided a good place to get this gunpowder would be at the island of New Providence in the Bahamas. Hopkins knew there was a lot of gunpowder there, as well as other military supplies. On March 3rd, the fleet arrived off Nassau and captured Fort Montague in the bloodless Battle of Nassau. Hopkins ordered his men that no person or property would be harmed as long as there was no resistance. The next morning, the governor of Fort Montague surrendered, but after most of the island's gunpowder had been sent to St. Augustine, Florida. This was not the big win that Hopkins and the Continental Navy had hoped for. However, the Americans did come away with as many guns as they could grab and other good British fighting stuff. The Continental Navy left the island, somewhat victorious, on March 17th. Alfred led the fleet home. On their way home, the fleet captured 2 British ships referred to as prizes. On April 6th, the fleet met a 20-gun British frigate by the name of Glasgow. The Glasgow put up a terrific fight and was able to escape. At the beginning of it all, the Glasgow shot a cannon at the Alfred's tiller ropes. The flagship of the fleet was unable to maneuver or pursue the enemy. You might imagine how John Paul Jones felt about this. If he had been captain of the Alfred, he would have at least tried harder to pursue the Glasgow than Captain Saltonstall did. The rest of the American fleet attempted to chase the Glasgow, but it got away. Unfortunately, the Glasgow made it to Newport, Rhode Island. This failure became a point of contention between the Marine Committee and Commodore Hopkins. Even if Hopkins had captured the Glasgow, it was likely that he would have still been under the committee's scrutiny for not doing what they wanted in the first place. On April 8th, the fleet arrived in New London, Connecticut. At first, the crew was hailed as heroes. They didn't exactly come back empty-handed. However, many of the officers and most significant members of the Continental Congress were not pleased with the way Hopkins handled things, and he was later relieved of command. It was a temporary censure. Future President John Adams would defend Hopkins and help get him acquitted. John Paul Jones himself would have dealings with John Adams a few years later. Hopkins was allowed to return to his position before being permanently fired in 1778. The Alfred remained out of commission through much of 1776, due mostly to a lack of funds for repairs. As fate would have it, John Paul Jones would be on the Alfred again much later in the year, and things would be different the next time around. The Providence. On May 10, 1776, John Paul Jones was reassigned to the Providence, a smaller ship than the Alfred. He was still a first lieutenant, but was placed in command of the ship. Long story short, the Providence did not, at present, have an official captain. There were 3 big achievements, however, that helped John Paul Jones become an official captain while still on the Providence. Big hero thing number 1, returning the 100 soldiers to George Washington. Jones went to New York and returned about 100 soldiers George Washington had loaned Essex Hopkins to help man the American fleet. Army men on Navy ships? People did what they had to do. In the end, it was this grit that helped America win this and other wars. Jones and Washington never became close friends, but they did cross paths over the years, at least in correspondence. Things between them were relatively polite, but they never had a chance to work together. Big hero thing number 2, rescuing a munitions brigantine from the British. Another great accomplishment is Jones' rescue of a brigantine from the British ship Cerberus. This particular brigantine was bringing munitions to America from the island of Hispaniola in the West Indies. Thanks to John Paul Jones, we were able to get all that good British killing stuff. Jones' stock was rising. He didn't have much of a chance to show what he could do on the Alfred. His next mission on the Providence is what got him his promotion to captain. Big hero thing number 3. Escorted a convoy of Colliers coal ships to Philadelphia. His ship escorted a convoy of Colliers to Philadelphia that arrived on August 1st. A collier is a cargo ship for coal. Coal was certainly important to people back then, and thanks to John Paul Jones, America was able to get a lot of it. On August 7th, 1776, John Paul Jones was officially made a captain. In the whole scope of things, he had become a captain for the Continental Navy in less than a year's service, but he had already had such an impressive resume that it would have been hard not to make him a captain. After this, it would appear John Paul Jones was an unstoppable force. The Providence left on August 21st to begin an independent cruise. In a short frame of time, he captured 2 ships and sent them to Philadelphia. Jones had captured a 3rd ship, but the British recaptured it before it could reach an American port. Ooh, so close. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. During the time when Jones was catching ships, he was also running away from them. Jones was a slippery one for the British, and they came to really, really hate him for that. The British took extreme umbrage with John Paul Jones, and over the years, in their propaganda, would depict him as a fearsome human monster. The Raid on Canso, number 1 of 2. On September 22nd, Jones would perform one of his most amazing feats, the Raid on Canso. Canso was a town in Nova Scotia, itself a province of Canada. Canso is on the northeastern tip of mainland Nova Scotia, and easy pickings for invaders. It had been raided many times over the years, long before the Revolution. This would be the first of 2 times John Paul Jones would hit Canso. It's amazing that, given its history of being raided so many times, that the port of Canso wasn't moved or, at the very least, better guarded. It's important to know that Canada was still under British rule at this time. Canada did not achieve its full independence from Britain until 1982, a long, long way into the future. Striking a blow in Canada was to hurt Britain. John Paul Jones and the Providence made a lot of damage in Canso. He destroyed 15 vessels and a lot of property. He burned a fishing schooner, sank a second ship, and captured a third ship that he used to carry fish from the first 2 ships. Jones captured another, smaller boat called a shallop that was used as tender. Tender is a boat used to service other boats, like moving people or materials from one to another. But he didn't stop there. John Paul learned from one of the captured fishermen that nearby Madam Island had several British merchantman ships. Since he was on a hot streak, Jones was feeling saucy and decided to go capture them. There were 9 British vessels, all anchored. They were taken without bloodshed because the fishermen offered no resistance. On September 26th, John Paul Jones and the Providence were on their way home. With all his prizes in tow, Jones rode out a severe storm. Before Providence returned to Narragansett Bay on October 8th, they captured the whaler Portland. This was the first real effective blow America delivered to Britain upon the ocean. We hurt them a bit. When the Providence was home, Essex Hopkins appointed John Paul Jones as captain of the Alfred. The Alfred was a larger ship and the flagship of the fleet. Hopkins still didn't like Jones, but he knew, as a lot of people did, that Jones could handle it. The Providence went to another captain. The Alfred, the second time around. These were glory days for John Paul Jones, and it kept getting better for him. He was a captain who had just pulled off a major coup that significantly hurt the enemy. On top of that, he had just been given command of the fleet's top ship. There was no way he could be ignored now by the Americans or the British. The Alfred departed Providence, Rhode Island, on October 26, 1776, in company with the Providence ship. Where do you think they went? Nova Scotia. Hey, if it worked the first time. It was a 2-part mission. Alfred Mission Number 1. Rescue hundreds of American prisoners from Cape Breton Island. Alfred Mission Number 2. Raid British shipping. Specifically, Jones and company were headed to Cape Breton Island, just north of Canso in mainland Nova Scotia. Going on Commodore Hopkins' orders, Jones was to free hundreds of American prisoners being forced to work in the coal mines and to raid British shipping. The first objective couldn't be accomplished due to poor winter weather conditions. This failure would later become a hotly debated subject for Jones with his superiors. The second objective, however, Jones was able to accomplish in glorious fashion. Jones proved he meant business and took 3 prizes. On November 11th, the Brigantine Active had an assorted cargo. On November 12th, he got the armed transport Mellish that held scads of winter uniforms. George Washington's men back in America would really appreciate this. On November 16th, Jones got the scow Kitty loaded with oil and fish. After this, the Providence ship had to sail home for repairs due to severe leaks. Jones didn't know what was going on with the Providence other than it was gone. The Alfred was now on its own. The raid on Canso, number 2 of 2. So for the second time in as many months, John Paul Jones raided Canso again. He just had a ball pushing these guys around. On November 22nd, while in Canso, again, Jones sent out boats from the Alfred to do a lot of damage. A transport that was loaded with provisions was burned. A warehouse that was full of whale oil was also burned down. In addition to those things, a small schooner was captured to replace the Providence. After all, Jones and his crew were thinking that the Providence was lost at sea. They wouldn't know any different until they got back to America. Just 2 days later, the Alfred captured 3 Colliers, coal ships. 2 days after that, Jones and friends caught a privateer ship. A privateer is a government-sanctioned pirate. John Paul Jones was so tough that he caught himself a pirate ship after having done a whole lot of pirate-type stuff himself. John Paul Jones was definitely a hated thorn in the side for the British. Many British still call John Paul Jones a pirate or privateer, although that was never his official occupation. Jones was overloaded with prizes and had to return home. He was pursued by the HMS Milford, but managed to outrun them. The Alfred and everything that came with it arrived safely in Boston on December 15, 1776 for a major refit. John Paul Jones secured his reputation for being a roughneck and getting results. However, it would be almost a year before he would get his next major assignment. 1777, the long wait. Despite his successes at sea, Jones had some major disagreements with those in authority. As soon as he got back to port in Boston, he began feuding with Commodore Hopkins. Jones believed Hopkins was hindering his advancement by talking down his campaign plans. But what we need to remember in all of this is that John Paul Jones failed a big part of his mission with the Alfred, which was to free the American prisoners on Cape Breton Island. Sure, he took a lot of prizes, and although appreciated, this was of secondary importance. Jones still claimed that extremely poor winter conditions hindered his rescue attempts of the prisoners. On January 12, 1777, Jones had to explain this to the Honorable Joseph Hughes, head of the Marine Committee and Secretary of the Navy. Jones and Hughes had always been on friendly terms, but you can see how Hughes' faith in Jones' integrity might have been shaken. If Jones was lying about bad winter weather just to get out of the dangerous mission of rescuing prisoners, it would be considered a coward's move. On January 14th, Commodore Hopkins ordered the replacement of John Paul Jones as captain of the Alfred. Jones was furious about this. If it wasn't clear to you by now, John Paul Jones and Essex Hopkins were not buddies. As we have discovered since Jones's early days, there were things about his personality that didn't click with everyone, and this is one of those times he rubbed somebody the wrong way. On January 21st, Jones protested to the Marine Committee against his removal from the Alfred, calling it an injustice. In reality, Hopkins was the Commodore and Jones' immediate boss. Whether you liked Hopkins' decision or not, he did have the authority to pull Jones from the Alfred. Hopkins, however, wasn't afforded the full respect of the Marine Committee. As another slap in the face to Hopkins' authority, the Marine Committee would deal with Jones directly in the future. 2 assignments for Jones fell through, one from the Marine Committee and one from Congress. Nobody knew what to do with him. Understandably, Jones wasn't feeling chummy with any of his superiors. On April 7th, 1777, Jones submitted plans for organization and government of the Navy. This was at the request of the President of Congress. Jones had been promoting the idea of proper standards for the Continental Navy since he started, especially in letters he wrote to Mr. Hughes. The higher-ups were finally taking notice, and Jones' contributions helped in establishing the Navy's rules and regulations. There was so much internal friction, not to mention the fact that the Navy owed Jones money, that it took until June 14, 1777, before he finally got a new command that was going to follow through. Once more, this command came from the Marine Committee. Commodore Hopkins and Captain John Paul Jones, at this point, were almost totally exclusive from each other. Jones had been and would continue to be reporting directly to the Marine Committee. As a side note, Essex Hopkins would be totally ousted from the Navy on January 2nd, 1778, for reasons too numerous to mention here. He would be the only commander-in-chief the Continental Navy ever had, as his position was eliminated. The Marine Committee handled those job functions from then on, and obviously this was more to Jones' liking. The ship at John Paul Jones' command was the newly constructed Ranger. It was a smaller ship than what he was used to, but it was made expressly for warfare and wasn't just a converted merchant vessel. This was something he didn't have before. Jones still lucked out, but he would never see it that way. He argued with John Langdon, the shipbuilder, every step of the way over the construction and equipping of the ship. It's not always easy for us to know if we'd like certain people from history if we knew them in person. John Langdon, however, appears to be one of the most upstanding individuals from the Revolutionary War era. He was an early supporter of the war against the British, and although a career politician, he temporarily withdrew to operate a shipyard for the war effort. Years later, he had a dazzling political career, not only as the governor of New Hampshire, but as one of the people who pushed hardest for the Constitution of the United States. Langdon was also not a fan of slavery. When he got to the age that he felt he was too old for politics, he gracefully retired. John Langdon really does seem like a good guy, but he and John Paul Jones weren't the best buddies. A lot of preparations had to be made, and the Ranger wouldn't set sail for many months to come. Jones never liked his crew because, for the most part, they were assigned to him and not of his choosing. With everything that had gone on with John Paul Jones in 1777, it is easy to see why he was perceived as being difficult. On June 14th, 1777, America adopted its Stars and Stripes flag, replacing the Grand Union flag. In December of 1775, John Paul Jones was the first to hoist the Grand Union flag while on the Alfred. It's uncertain who first hoisted the Stars and Stripes, but we do know it was either on the Ranger or Raleigh. It's very well known, however, that John Paul Jones was captain of the ship where the Stars and Stripes flag had been saluted by a foreign power for the first time. More on that later. The Ranger. Finally, on November 1st, 1777, Captain John Paul Jones set sail on the Ranger for France from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. His second in command was First Lieutenant Thomas Simpson. Jones and Simpson didn't like each other from the very start, a factor that would play big into the poor relations between captain and crew. There were a few major purposes for the Ranger's trip to France. Ranger Mission Number 1: carry dispatches of Burgoyne's surrender to American commissioners in Paris. Ranger Mission Number 2: swap out the Ranger for the Indian, a bigger, better ship. The first was to carry dispatches telling of Burgoyne's surrender to the commissioners in Paris. Why was this news of any importance, let alone to sail all the way to France to deliver it? General John Burgoyne was a British general who had surrendered along with his 6,200 men at Saratoga, New York. This happened on October 17, 1777, shortly before John Paul Jones set out to sea for the first time in nearly a year. Burgoyne's surrender was a major turning point in the war, because it finally secured the assistance from France that America needed so badly for victory. America got its street cred. France wasn't about to back someone they didn't think stood a chance of winning against the hated British. Now it looked like America had a shot with the proper assistance. Burgoyne had been an extremely accomplished general since 1762. He returned to London after this great defeat, and it completely destroyed his military career. A second reason for the trip to France, and specifically for Jones, was to pick up a new heavy frigate called Indian that Holland made especially for America. Holland was neutral in the war, but they didn't like the British either. The Indian was going to be an upgrade for Jones from the Ranger. Although a new ship, Jones was basically settling for the Ranger just to have a command until he got something better. In addition to getting the bigger ship, he was also going to get a crew of experienced French seamen versus the inexperienced crew of slobs he had now. Jones may not have been entirely enchanted with the Ranger, but it would perform a good service for him. As for the Indian, this ship would be forever Jones's unattainable unicorn. He would try many times to get command of this ship, but it would never come to pass. On his way to France, Jones and the Ranger captured 2 British brigs. When he arrived in Nantes, France, on December 2nd, Jones sold the prizes. On the same day, he forwarded the papers about Burgoyne surrendered to Paris. It wasn't until 3 days later that Jones actually visited the commissioners in Paris. There were 3: Silas Deane, Arthur Lee, and Senior Commissioner Benjamin Franklin. Silas Deane was soon replaced by John Adams, who arrived in April of 1778. Arthur Lee hated John Paul Jones. Lee, however, also didn't like his job very much or being in France. Benjamin Franklin, on the other hand, became a buddy to Jones. It's unusual to have that kind of tight friendship in a boss-employee situation, but they managed to pull it off. The commissioners listened to Jones' strategic commands. Franklin introduced Jones to Parisian society and international politics. This is knowledge that Jones would come to appreciate because he spent a good chunk of his life in Paris during and after the Revolutionary War. Jones had one time said America was the country of his fond election. France, however, would also become very important to him in the years to come. Benjamin Franklin was a distinguished early American, a legend in his own time. His life accomplishments are too numerous to list. One of his many memorable creations was an annual publication called Poor Richard's Almanac. These books were extremely popular in America and published from 1732 to 58. Poor Richard was the pen name Franklin used. By the time John Paul Jones met Ben Franklin in France, the book had been out of publication for 20 years. However, they had been published in France under the title Bonhomme Richard. It was this name that would later become linked to the legend of John Paul Jones, and he had Benjamin Franklin to thank for that. 1778. John Paul Jones is still in France. He learns that the bigger, better ship he wanted, the Indian, is unavailable. Here's the reason why. Holland was building the Indian for America. They were neutral in the war, but they still sympathized with America. Britain, however, put pressure on the Dutch to sell it to France instead. Giving the ship to the Americans at this point would have been considered a slap to Britain's face. It might have been hard for Holland after that to stay out of the war. At the time, France was not allied with America. The Indian was sold to King Louis XVI. France did have the ship, but Jones wasn't getting it. As a matter of fact, no one was getting that ship for another 2 years. John Paul Jones would never get the Indian, despite trying very hard to get it. For whatever political reason, this ship was off limits to Jones. Jones was let down, but the commissioners did pay for a refit of the Ranger. Captain Jones settled for this, but he wasn't overjoyed. On February 6, 1778, France signed the Treaty of Alliance with America. France was on America's side now, and we needed them badly. This treaty is also significant for the fact that it formally recognized America as its own country. Britain just wanted to see America as a bunch of upstarts pretending we had our own country. For the first time, America was acknowledged as its own country. It wasn't but 8 days later, on February 14th, that John Paul Jones was part of another historic moment. The Ranger was in Quiberon Bay. The admiral of the French ship, Robust, gave a 9-gun salute to the Ranger, and most notably the Stars and Stripes flag it was flying. This was the first time a foreign power saluted the Stars and Stripes. It was on March 3rd that the Ranger sailed from Quiberon Bay. Jones and the Ranger spent a lot of time sailing off the coast of France. Bad weather kept the Ranger from leaving Brest until April the 10th. With it was the French frigate Fortuna. After this is when the action started to pick up. On April 14th, the Ranger was off the southwest coast of Ireland where it captured 2 prizes, scuttling the first. The second was sent back to Brest. The Irish coast saw far more of John Paul Jones in the Ranger than they wanted to. Jones was like a savage beast at sea, but at the same time, he had to be wary of a nearly mutinous crew. It would seem Jones had a lot of trouble with mutinous sailors in his life. This time, Jones would credit his poor crew relations to his officers, and particularly his second-in-command, First Lieutenant Thomas Simpson. Jones already didn't like his officers or crew, equating them as privateers or pirates. He later said that these men were in it purely for gain and not for honor. As far as Simpson and his other officers, he believed they allowed the crew to question his orders, inciting mutiny so that Simpson could become captain. On April 17th, Jones persuaded his crew to raid Whitehaven in England. This is where John Paul had started his maritime career all those years ago at the age of 13. He knew that such an attack at this busy port town would be a real blow to the British. And it's not as if anybody in Whitehaven liked him anymore anyway. The plan was foiled by the winds, so the Ranger moved up closer to Ireland. However, Jones would hit Whitehaven at a later date. In lieu of trashing Whitehaven, Jones was still able to make a nuisance of himself. On April 19th, he sunk a Scottish schooner. The next day, he sunk a sloop. On the 21st, Jones took a fishing boat. He really wanted to take the warship Drake, but this didn't happen. Officially, the reason was bad weather. Unofficially, Jones' crew was, at first, unwilling to undertake the mission. When an attempt was made after midnight, incompetency of the crew members botched the mission and the Ranger had to flee. This might have bothered John Paul more than it did, but the wind shifted and he was able to take another crack at the whole crushing Whitehaven thing. The raid on Whitehaven. Jones' idea for the attack was awesome, but it didn't at all go according to plan. Jones himself, in 2 boats of 15 men, left the Ranger at midnight on April 23rd. Jones knew there would be anywhere from 200 to 400 ships. There would be many merchant vessels, as well as many coal transporters, and he wanted to burn and destroy all of them. The men also planned to terrorize the townspeople by lighting other fires. In addition, they knew an important town such as Whitehaven would have big defensive guns, and they wanted to take them out. Well, Jones did spike the town's defensive guns to prevent them being fired. Lighting fires was an impossibility. The lanterns that they had in both boats ran out of fuel. Some of the party was sent to raid a public house to get more lantern fuel, or whatever they could use to cause mayhem, but the temptation for these men to have a quick drink delayed that plan. Jones was working with a bunch of stooges. Dawn was already breaking by the time the men returned with fuel and began the arson attacks, so efforts were concentrated on just one coal ship, Thompson, in the hope that the flames would spread to the other ships. However, a crew member of the Thompson saw the men in the twilight and alerted everyone that a fire had been started. The townspeople came to the scene. 2 fire engines put out the fire and the Americans were chased away. They wanted to shoot at Jones and the fleeing boats, but soon discovered their guns had been damaged. Jones' raid on Whitehaven was an unmitigated disaster. The kidnapping of the Earl of Selkirk. The next day, Jones had another big plot in mind. This time, him and the boys would go from Whitehaven to Scotland. The place? St. Mary's Isle, near Kirkcudbright. Kirkcudbright was the same area where John Paul was born and raised. His big plan? To kidnap Dunbar Douglas, the 4th Earl of Selkirk, and hold him for ransom. What was wanted for ransom? The Earl of Selkirk would be exchanged for American sailors that had been taken prisoner by the British Navy. This plan flopped due to the fact that the Earl wasn't even there. The crew didn't want to leave empty-handed. Jones didn't like it, but he allowed his crew to steal the family silver. If he hadn't let the crew do this, they may very well have turned on him. Even that plan flopped because a butler gave them a sack that was mostly filled with coal and topped off with just a small number of silverware items. Still, Jones was so embarrassed by the crew's actions that when the silverware was sold off in France, he bought it and returned it to the Earl of Selkirk after the war, 6 years later. The Whitehaven and St. Mary's Isle missions were terrible, bumbling fiascos, mostly due to a lack of cohesion between captain and crew. Jones had some decent early successes on the Ranger, but some pretty big failures. The capture of the Drake. Jones' self-esteem wasn't totally squashed. He wanted to make another attempt at the Drake that was anchored in Carrickfergus, present-day Northern Ireland. This time, on April 24th, Jones and the Ranger was successful. The Drake was taken after an hour-long gun battle. The captain of the Drake had been killed in the process, as well as one of Jones' lieutenants. The Drake was a big catch. After all, it was a 20-gun man-of-war. However, the whole thing was a bloody mess. A brig called Patience was captured the next day. On April 26th, Jones had his second-in-command, Simpson, take charge of the Drake for the return to Brest. The ship separated on the way back as the Ranger chased another prize. The Ranger caught the brig, but Jones was upset with Simpson for splitting off. On May 6th, Jones had another of his lieutenants, Elijah Hall, go on board the Drake and take command from Simpson. 2 days later, the Ranger and Drake returned to Brest with Simpson detained on board. Jones reported Simpson to his superiors on May 9th and wanted him court-martialed. Did Lieutenant Thomas Simpson get court-martialed? No. Future President John Adams, who was still a commissioner in France, was partly responsible for Simpson being released from Jones' accusation. Adams didn't like the other two commissioners, Arthur Lee and Benjamin Franklin. He thought Lee was paranoid and cynical. Franklin, Adams thought, was irritating, lazy, and too accommodating with the French. Franklin and Jones were friends, so that naturally put Jones in the crosshairs with John Adams. Jones' own character gets called heavily into question at this time. John Adams believed that the overwhelming majority of the evidence supported Simpson's claims of innocence. Adams also believed that Jones was hoping to monopolize the mission's glory, especially by detaining Simpson on board, while he celebrated the capture of the Drake and other prizes with many important European dignitaries. We've known for a long time that John Paul Jones liked rubbing shoulders with the big boys to further himself. Did Jones set up Simpson to look bad in order to make himself look better? After all, Jones had some big failures on his last voyage. The capture of the Drake was the only major achievement. To this day, there is still uncertainty as to exactly what occurred on the mission. Was John Paul Jones behaving honorably? Did John Adams get it all wrong? We do know some things about Jones's time on the Ranger. 1. The crew didn't like him and felt alienated. 2. The Drake was one of the few significant victories the Continental Navy had over the Royal Navy during the war. 3. The Ranger's victory over the Drake was highly regarded and added some shine to Jones's reputation. 4. The capture of the Drake was one of the symbolic feats of American spirit that helped establish the United States Navy after the Revolution. After the Drake, the rest of 1778. The Drake was a big win for John Paul Jones, but things didn't go smooth for the captain who had made a name for himself. As soon as the Ranger had returned, Jones's crew submitted a petition to the American commissioners in France, recommending that Jones be removed from command. There was a definite rift between Jones and the Ranger's crew. Historians still debate to this day who was at fault for these bad feelings and why. The only thing that really matters is that John Paul Jones did not have the respect of his crew. Jones wasn't going to be removed from command unless he was known to have done something wrong. Still, Jones's superiors were going to pay attention to the fact that he didn't know how to handle people. John Paul Jones requested a court-martial of Lieutenant Thomas Simpson. It was an ugly back and forth. Jones made his reports while at the same time tried to get money for his crew and himself. Once again, he could not get the bigger ship he desired. Despite the great acclaim he received for capturing the Drake, the events that followed for Jones were hardly a hero's welcome. The American commissioners in France persuaded Jones to drop his prosecution of Simpson. Simpson was given command of the Ranger and with its crew sailed back to America. Thus ended Jones' time with the Ranger. Simpson won this first round. It was a political defeat for Jones. He wasn't necessarily unhappy to see the Ranger or its crew go, but Simpson got command of his ship, and Jones remained in France without a command. Jones would try again to get Simpson court-martialed after his hated first lieutenant arrived in America. This too would prove unsuccessful. Simpson won the second and final round against Jones. The rest of 1778 saw John Paul Jones in France without a ship. Publicly, he was lauded as a great hero who had done something big for America. Privately, he was at odds with most of his superiors in the Navy. 1779, however, would play out very different for Jones and give him his most storied victory of all. In Part 3, John Paul Jones has his greatest battle at sea, but struggles with life until his untimely death. It takes over a century before Jones gets proper recognition for his services, but he finally achieves legend status.